An unhealthy obsession destroyed his girlfriend. Have you ever pondered how life can spiral into chaos in a heartbeat? A single decision, a momentous event, and suddenly the world as you know it is irreversibly altered. I'm about to share a tale that began on what seemed like any other day but took a turn so unforeseen, no one could have predicted it. Picture this. It's 3 a.m. The doorbell chimes. You shuffle to the door, half expecting a neighbor or perhaps a delivery mix-up. However, standing before you is someone you believed was gone from your life for good. His eyes burn with fury, his fists are balled tight, and the atmosphere thickens with tension. What's your move? Do you scream, attempt to flee, or are you paralyzed by the realization that this could be your gravest error? This is the chilling onset of Alina Shaykh's story. One day, she resolved that true love should never inflict pain. She thought she had closed that chapter of her life. But he returned. And the events that unfolded not only shocked her, but everyone acquainted with her. Alina Shaykh was born in Russia in 1997. At the tender age of 7, she migrated with her family to Pennsylvania, USA. As a child, she was curious and vibrant, swiftly picking up English and developing a passion for both arts and sciences. Throughout her school years, she was seen as a driven and talented individual, consistently striving toward her objectives. Known for her kindness and empathy, she frequently assisted her classmates and was active in charitable events. After high school, Alina enrolled at the University of Pittsburgh to pursue a degree in biology. Driven by her aspiration to become a doctor, she dedicated herself to her studies. Alina was well-liked among her peers, known for her radiant personality and readiness to lend a helping hand or an ear. Her commitment to fairness and kindness made her a standout figure. Her parents, Ellie and Ian Shaykh, were a source of immense pride and support. Being an only child, she was the heartbeat of their lives. Their connection was profound, often traveling together and backing each other in all pursuits. However, October 2017 brought a level of distress to the Shaykh family that was beyond anyone's imagination. Ellie and Ian, the parents of 20-year-old Alina, had grown used to her frequent check-ins. Their daughter was always a text or call away, especially when they had shared plans on the horizon. Yet, on this particular day, an unsettling silence enveloped their home. Alina had vanished without a trace. The day was significant as it was the day of the annual charity marathon, a breast cancer awareness event that was dear to their hearts. Alina was usually at the forefront of these events, her commitment to the cause deep and genuine. It seemed she derived her strength from supporting others, almost as if she was shielding her family from the harsh realities outside their door. That morning, however, Alina was nowhere to be found. Her usual messages and calls were conspicuously absent, and each passing minute was agonizing. Ellie, riddled with anxiety, compulsively checked her phone, while Ian, who was driving them to the University of Pittsburgh, where Alina rented an apartment, tried to maintain his composure. Despite his efforts, the tension was palpable, his hands shook, and his gaze was fixed. The journey, typically a brisk 30 minutes, felt interminably long as they braced for the worst. Upon arriving, Ellie darted towards the apartment, barely noticing Ian or their dog, who stayed behind in the car. Her heart hammered against her chest, and her hands trembled as she pressed the doorbell. The brief wait before the door opened felt eternal. Inside, the silence was oppressive, as if the very walls were tightening around them. Standing at the threshold of their daughter's apartment, Ellie and Ian were met not by the comforting signs of Alina's presence, but by a void filled with chilling silence and unanswered questions. The world seemed to pause, heavy with dread, as they stepped into the unknown. Ellie retrieved her phone to attempt one final call to Alina. Each ring, echoing hollow and deep, seemed to sever the last strands of hope within her. Just half an hour before, this day had started like any other. Now it was morphing into the Shaykh family's most harrowing nightmare. Standing before Alina's locked apartment door, Ellie's desperation mounted. She pounded on the door, the dull thuds echoing ominously through the apartment. She called out for her daughter, her voice cracking under the strain, escalating to a frantic yell, but only silence answered back. In that moment, Ellie felt something inside her break. Panic taking hold, Ellie screamed for Jan. He rushed in, his fear propelling him into action, knowing that every second they delayed was precious. His repeated blows to the door intensified the dread building in their hearts. Finally, the door swung open with a jarring crash, revealing a scene that stopped them cold. Zach, Alina's neighbor, had been observing from the staircase. Feeling suddenly intrusive, he instinctively stepped back, Trying to distance himself from the unfolding horror, Ellie and Jan stepped into a silence that was thick with the unspeakable. The room was a tableau of dark stains and chaos, like a grotesque scene ripped from a nightmare. The walls and floor were marred with traces of violence, absorbing all light and hope. At first glance, Alina's face was beyond recognition, so brutalized that her parents couldn't comprehend they were staring at their daughter. Ellie's screams shattered the oppressive silence, her anguish echoing off the walls, as if trying to wake the very structure itself. Jan stood frozen beside her, his mind unable to grasp the full extent of the horror before them. Time seemed to halt, suspended in the grim reality that nothing would ever return to how it once was. The family dog, attuned to the rising panic, began to bark furiously, adding to the turmoil enveloping the household. It was as if a shroud of impenetrable darkness had descended over the house. Ellie's screams continued unabated while Jan, mustering the courage to act, stepped forward, his legs trembling with uncertainty and fear. None of them knew how to confront the horror that had breached the sanctity of their home. Zach, drawn by the harrowing cries, summoned the courage to approach the room. He halted at the threshold, reluctant to enter, yet already sensing the irreversible change this event would bring to the family. There, on the floor, lay Alina. Her body was sprawled as though she had battled fiercely to the end, desperately fighting for her life. Half of her face was gruesomely marred, stripped of its identity by the brutality inflicted upon her. In a state of shock, Zach fumbled with his phone to call emergency services, his hands shaking as if the very air were thickening around him. Before long, the shrill sound of sirens cut through the morning stillness. They grew louder as they neared, piercing the quiet of the now deserted streets. The ambulance skidded to a stop outside the house, and the paramedics, grim-faced and efficient, hastened to the door. Their footsteps resonated in the stark, unwelcoming hallway, every second pulsating with hostility. Ellie, paralyzed by grief at the doorway, met the paramedics with a gaze so fraught with despair it spoke volumes. They understood immediately that the tragedy had irreparably altered her. Her hands trembled violently, barely allowing her to gesture toward the room. Jan stood by, overwhelmed and mute, as the paramedics passed him. They entered the dimly lit room where the scant light filtering through the curtains only deepened the macabre atmosphere. They knelt beside Alina's body, their actions swift and procedural, checking for signs of life, their exchanged glances confirming the grim reality. For Jan and Ellie, those few seconds stretched into an eternity. When one of the paramedics solemnly shook his head, their world shattered. Ellie's grief was visceral. She collapsed to her knees, her screams piercing the air as if to reverse time itself and restore her daughter's life. Jan, numbed by shock, did the only thing left to him. He wrapped his arms around his wife, trying to ground her even as his own world felt untethered. The paramedics lingered in the room, preparing for the somber formalities of declaring death. For Ellie and Jan, the confirmation felt like a life sentence, an irreversible verdict from which they would never fully recover. Outside, the flashing red and blue lights of police cars bathed the street, drawing the attention of the neighborhood. Curiosity piqued. A crowd began to form, whispers filled the air, nervous glances were exchanged, and phones were raised to capture the unfolding drama. Onlookers gazed at the scene unfolding at Alina Shaykh's house, now cordoned off with barricades and patrol cars. The officers set up barriers with stern expressions, methodically isolating the crime scene from the community as if to protect the town from the horror that had occurred behind those closed doors. Police Chief Scott Schubert was at the forefront, personally overseeing the investigation. Along with his team of detectives, he combed through every inch of the scene, documenting the disarray with meticulous care. A broken mirror, a table knocked askew, and personal belongings strewn in disarray all testified to a violent struggle. The medical examiner's report later confirmed that Alina had died from multiple blunt force injuries. This was no silent, impulsive act of passion, but a savage and deliberate assault, each detail echoing with brutality, terror, and utter despair. As the crowd outside swelled, so did the murmurs and speculation. Some discussed her tumultuous relationship with her boyfriend, while others traded hearsay and rumors. Yet, no one could have foreseen such a tragic conclusion. The usual tranquility of the suburban neighborhood was irrevocably broken, with the crime destined to become the focal point of local discussions for a long time. The police quickly zeroed in on a prime suspect, Alina's ex-boyfriend, Matthew Darby. A promising basketball player at the university, Matthew was not just celebrated for his athletic prowess, but also for his charm and popularity among peers. Surrounded by admirers, he was the epitome of charisma and success. Yet beneath this veneer, there lurked a spectrum of darker, more destructive emotions that surfaced in his dealings with Alina. Their relationship, which had blossomed at a university in Greensburg, soon escalated into an intense affair marked by passion. However, the fervor of their connection soon spiraled into jealousy and attempts at control by Matthew. The dynamic between them shifted dramatically after Alina transferred to another campus to focus more on her studies and escape the unhealthy relationship. Determined to start anew, she ended things with Matthew, a decision that he could not stomach. His usual confidence shattered, leaving him with a festering anger that spiraled out of control. He began to follow her, inundate her with calls, and eventually he crossed a severe line. On the 20th of September 2017, a frightened Alina filed a police report. Matthew had escalated to breaking into her home, entering through a second-story window in a manner reminiscent of a horror film. She recounted hearing someone climb the drain pipe, a sound so chilling that even in her most fearful moments, she hadn't imagined it would be him. Bursting into her room with eyes ablaze, he accused her of betrayal, his anger palpable and terrifying. In his rage, he physically assaulted her, pushing her onto the bed and squeezing her wrists so tightly that bruises formed and lingered. Alina's decision to file the report brought her a mix of terror and relief, believing justice would prevail and that she could put an end to his harassment. Supported by her parents, Jan and Ellie, she appeared in court where a restraining order was issued against Matthew, a move they hoped would secure some peace. The restraining order seemed like a step toward tranquility. In the courtroom, tightly holding her hands, Jan and Ellie watched as the judge ordered Matthew's arrest for unlawful entry. This moment in court, where he was taken into custody, was a glimmer of hope for Alina and her family, suggesting an end to the months of fear she had endured. However, their relief was short-lived. Matthew was soon released on bail set at $10,000, a sum that seemed trivial within the legal system but monumental in its consequences. Unbeknownst to Jan and Ellie, this decision set the stage for a dire sequence of events. Just days after his release, the very home they had believed to be a safe haven transformed into the site of an unspeakable tragedy. The palpable sense of dread that had loomed over them had now manifested in the most horrific way imaginable. As the investigation progressed, each step the detectives took was shadowed by the bitter realization that crucial moments to protect Alina had slipped through the cracks. Ellie, standing just beyond the police tape, had ceased her crying. Her expression was shocked and disbelief, her features frozen as she grappled with the grim reality before her. Jan, offering a silent pillar of support, stood by her side, gripping her hand tightly. Matthew Darby's presence in Alina's life had been ominously persistent. His shadow seemed to loom over her every move. Alina's neighbor, Zach, later confessed that he frequently noticed Darby lurking outside her residence, blending into the environment as though he were a permanent fixture of the landscape. Zach, reflecting on these observations, realized too late that he had been a passive spectator to the unfolding tragedy, witnessing Darby's haunting vigil. He had watched Darby standing in the shadows for hours, peering through the windows, stalking Alina with a chilling persistence. Matthew's jealousy knew no bounds. It was fierce and consuming, like a predator tearing through its prey. Zach recalled a particularly tense night when he overheard Darby vehemently accusing Alina right outside her apartment, his voice thick with unchecked rage and possessiveness. Each confrontation seemed carefully orchestrated by Darby, escalating in intensity and malice over time. In the weeks leading up to the tragedy, Darby had escalated his control over Alina by infiltrating her digital life, hacking her social media accounts, and erasing any interactions she had with other men. His obsession extended into the virtual realm, determined to isolate her. Despite Alina's efforts to establish boundaries and regain some semblance of autonomy, Darby's invasions were relentless. On the fateful night of September 20th, unknown horrors unfolded behind closed doors. Zach reported hearing a peculiar noise, dismissing it initially as a common occurrence in an old building. However, this was soon followed by a loud crash and a scream, a harrowing sound that tore through the quiet of the night, embodying terror and despair. Unsure of how to respond, Zach sent a frantic message to the house's group chat, desperate for any sign of normalcy, but the silence that followed was ominous. It was only later revealed that at that very moment, Matthew Darby had forcibly entered the house, commencing his brutal assault on Alina. While the neighborhood lay in slumber, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding next door, The police were meticulously combing through Alina's phone records, which had mysteriously disappeared from her apartment post-crime. According to investigation records, Alina had been desperately attempting to summon help between 4:15 and 4:55 a.m. The final call was dialed from Darby's phone, and location data pinpointed Alina's phone near Route A76 close to Irwin, a last unanswered plea for help. In a bizarre twist, a taxi driver crucial to the case later provided a chilling account to the police. He recalled dropping Darby off at the intersection of Seal Street and Ward Street in Oakland around 4:21 a.m. Darby had asked him to wait a few minutes, which soon extended to 20. Growing increasingly uneasy, the driver eventually left without his fare, sensing that something was profoundly amiss. As the police scoured more clues, they analyzed surveillance footage from a camera positioned near Alina's residence. The footage depicted a figure closely resembling Matthew Darby, moving stealthily down the street with large black bags in hand, scanning the surroundings with the caution of a predator concealing its tracks. The camera captured a particularly damning moment when Darby stopped at a manhole cover, opened it, and meticulously lowered the bags inside, attempting to erase the physical remnants of his guilt and cruelty. Detective Edward Fair, who was spearheading the investigation, wasted no time in dispatching his team to the scene. The forensic team proceeded with utmost care, lifting the manhole cover to uncover 2 knives and a hammer, all bearing traces of dried blood. The hammer was particularly gruesome, with strands of hair and pieces of skin adhering to it, leaving an indelible impression on all those involved in the case, a silent testament to the brutal and merciless nature of the crime. With the forensic analysis underway, the identification of the evidence was poised to corroborate their worst fears. Each piece of evidence underscored a systemic failure to protect Alina. Meanwhile, Matthew Darby had vanished as if swallowed by the earth, leaving behind a trail of horror and despair. The police, armed with compelling evidence and surveillance footage that tied Darby to the crime, hurriedly secured an arrest warrant. Despite their efforts, by the time the full-scale manhunt was initiated, Darby had already fled Pennsylvania, vanishing into the vastness of the country and evading immediate capture. In the courtroom, the prosecution meticulously presented evidence, each piece underscoring the premeditation behind Matthew Darby's heinous actions. A critical element was security footage from Duquesne University, captured the night before the crime, which vividly depicted Darby pacing the campus, casting nervous glances over his shoulder. An officer patrolling the area that night testified that Darby appeared agitated and possibly under the influence as he tried to access the student union building under the pretense of needing to charge his phone. His demeanor and actions triggered alarms, suggesting he was trying to evade someone or something. This growing compilation of evidence painted a damning picture of Darby, a figure now synonymous with pain and injustice. The pivotal moment in court came when a photograph of him in the campus elevator, dressed in a distinctive striped shirt emblazoned with a beer logo, was displayed. This was the same shirt he was wearing at the time of his arrest. The prosecution argued convincingly that after leaving the campus around 4 a.m., Darby called a taxi and headed directly to where Alina lived, weaving a narrative of calculated movements leading to the crime. The evidence of the break-in and the subsequent signs of a violent struggle were compelling, aligning seamlessly with the other evidence recovered at the crime scene. However, Darby's defense, led by attorney David Shree, contested every point. Shree challenged the identification credibility of the security footage and suggested that someone else might have used Darby's account to call the taxi, pushing the narrative that the evidence was circumstantial and not conclusive of Darby's guilt. This line of defense seemed unlikely to sway the court, especially when further developments surfaced. Darby was apprehended in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, while attempting to break into a residence using a fake ID, which only served to reinforce the prosecution's portrayal of him as a fugitive and further implicated him in the overarching narrative of his guilt. A year after his initial conviction, Darby sought a retrial, this time represented by a new attorney, Joseph Haddock. He contested the adequacy of his previous legal representation, arguing through Haddock that he had not been fully apprised of the potential consequences and risks associated with his trial. This move was seen as a desperate attempt to overturn his conviction by challenging the effectiveness of his former counsel. As these legal battles unfolded, the court and public watched closely, weighing the evidence of Darby's premeditated actions against his continuous claims of inadequate representation. Each session in the courtroom peeled back layers of the case, revealing the complexities and challenges of legal proceedings in such a high-stakes matter. This renewed legal challenge to overturn the conviction rested on the claim of inadequate representation, prompting the Allegheny District Attorney's Office to swiftly counter Darby's appeal. Prosecutors asserted that Darby's rights had been thoroughly upheld throughout the trial, but despite their assurances, the possibility of reopening the case for a new hearing loomed. In the courtroom, discussions pivoted to the principle of coordinating jurisdiction, which generally discourages judges in one district from overturning decisions made in another without substantial reasons. This legal doctrine could potentially delay proceedings, but wasn't likely to halt them completely. Undeterred, Darby and his legal team pressed on, preparing fresh evidence and scouting for any procedural cracks that might offer a chance to challenge the life sentence he faced. The narrative continued to unfold as Darby, sentenced to life without parole, sought another appeal. This time, he claimed that his most recent legal counsel had failed to exhaust all possible defenses. Years after his initial sentencing, Darby's quest for freedom was reignited, reflecting a relentless pursuit that echoed throughout the legal system. Meanwhile, the tragic loss of Alina transformed her from a victim to a catalyst for systemic change. Motivated by her memory, her family and friends advocated tirelessly to strengthen protections for women and to ensure her death would catalyze positive change. Alina's legacy evolved into a powerful symbol of resilience and a call to action against domestic violence. Addressing the audience directly, the narrative shifts focus, challenging each listener to reflect on how such tragedies can be prevented in the future. It calls for collective action against domestic violence, emphasizing the necessity of awareness at both the familial level and within broader legislative frameworks. The message is clear: love should not inflict pain, and genuine care should never manifest as control. As the story of Alina's life and the aftermath of her death continues to unfold, her enduring influence is highlighted, not just in the lives she touched, but also in the ongoing fight for justice and change she inspired. Her story serves as a poignant reminder of the work still needed to safeguard others from similar fates, ensuring her spirit continues to guide efforts to make the world a safer place for all.